In the remote mountains of northern Spain, beyond the reach of modernity, lies an ancient village, untouched by time, but plagued by something far darker. The wind always carries with it a chill, as if whispering secrets from the past. To the villagers, those whispers were warnings, reminders of an old, terrifying legend. The name El Sacamantecas lingers like a curse. The stories say he was once a man, but in time, he became something far worse, a monster driven by madness and a grotesque hunger. They say he roamed the mountains and forests at night, hunting for his prey. He was no mere murderer. El Sacamantecas didn't just kill, he drained his victims of their very essence, taking what he believed to be the most valuable substance in a human body: their fat. To the villagers, he was the embodiment of all their fears. Parents whispered his name to scare children into obedience, but deep down, everyone feared the legend wasn't just a story. Was it possible that something so unspeakable had once walked among them? Or worse, was he still out there lurking? Francisco Ortega was once a simple butcher in the village, a man of few words, always focused on his work. In the early days, no one suspected the horrors to come. Life in the village was hard. Poverty, illness, and hunger gnawed at the people like rats in the night. Francisco's butcher shop was a rare source of sustenance, but behind his stoic demeanor, something sinister festered. Francisco had become obsessed with an ancient folktale, one that spoke of the mystical properties of human fat. According to legend, it could heal wounds, cure diseases, and even bring eternal youth. As the townspeople fell sick from disease and famine, Francisco's mind darkened. He began to see his neighbors, his customers, not as people, but as a resource, flesh that could be harvested. At first he sought out wisdom from old healers and folk witches. They gave him cryptic advice, but it wasn't enough. Desperate for results, he began experimenting. At first he used animals, dogs, cats, pigs, but their fat didn't have the power he sought. His obsession deepened, and soon his experiments took a darker turn. Francisco's gaze shifted to those he saw as vulnerable: the poor, the sick, the orphaned children who wandered the village streets. It was a night darker than any the village had seen in years. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds, and the streets were eerily empty. Francisco Ortega moved like a shadow through the narrow cobblestone paths, his footsteps silent. That night, his eyes were fixed on a small boy, an orphan who had been begging for food near the town square. The boy was barely 10, thin from hunger, and so easily forgotten by the world around him. With a promise of food, Francisco lured the boy to his shop. The butcher's cleaver hung on the wall, glinting faintly in the dim candlelight. Francisco worked quickly, his hands trembling with both fear and excitement. The boy never had a chance to scream. What Francisco did next would haunt the village for generations. He drained the fat from the boy's body, storing it in jars as though it were the most precious treasure. By morning, the boy was gone, his body discarded in a ravine outside the village. The villagers searched, but there were no answers, only suspicion. Whispers began to grow, fear spreading through the streets like a wildfire. People began locking their doors and warning their children not to wander after dark. No one spoke his name yet, but the old stories crept back into their minds. Could it be? Would El Sacamantecas have returned? In the weeks that followed, the village was gripped by a new fear. The disappearances became more frequent, always children, always the forgotten ones, those with no one to protect them. The villagers grew paranoid. They no longer let their children out to play after the sun dipped below the horizon. Even in broad daylight, the streets felt empty and cold, as if a shadow loomed over the village. Superstitions began to grow. People hung garlic on their doors and wore charms to ward off evil spirits. Old women muttered prayers to ancient gods, their hands trembling with fear. They knew, deep down, that this wasn't the work of a mere man. Some said Francisco had made a pact with the devil, trading his soul for the power to harvest human fat. Others believed that he had become possessed, no longer a man, but a demon wearing his skin. At night, the village was silent, except for the occasional chilling sound of footsteps in the distance. No one dared look out their windows to see who it was, for they already knew the answer. El Sacamantecas was hunting. Among the fearful was Maria, a widow who lived on the edge of the village with her only daughter, Rosalia. Since the death of her husband, Maria had done everything to protect her little girl. But in a village plagued by poverty, where desperation clung to every corner, even love wasn't enough to shield them from the lurking dangers. One night, as the wind howled outside her small house, Maria woke with a start. There it was again, the sound of creaking floorboards. Panic surged through her veins as she leaped out of bed and rushed down the narrow hallway to Rosalia's room. Her heart pounded as she pushed open the door. The room was cold, the window wide open, letting in the biting night air. The bed was empty. In the distance, through the fog, Maria saw a shadow, a figure slipping into the darkness, carrying something small, something fragile. Her blood turned to ice. Her heart shattered as she realized what had happened. El Sacamantecas had come for her daughter. Maria's cries echoed through the village that night, piercing the silence like a blade. The villagers gathered, holding lanterns, their faces pale with fear. But this time, they couldn't stay hidden. They couldn't pretend it was just a legend. Rosalia was gone, and with her, the last shred of hope the village had clung to. Led by Maria's brother, a group of men armed themselves with torches, axes, and anything they could find. They swore they would find Francisco Ortega and bring him to justice. For hours they combed the woods surrounding the village, their torches flickering in the darkness. The trees seemed to close in around them, the thick fog swallowing their path. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent their hearts racing. As they pressed deeper into the forest, the air became thick with the smell of decay. They knew they were getting close. Something unnatural lay ahead, and then through the tangled branches they saw it, a crumbling, dilapidated cabin hidden from the world. The door to the cabin creaked open under the weight of their fear. The stench of rot and death hit them like a wave. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of a sickly, yellowish substance. Human fat. Some jars still had names scratched into them, names of the children who had vanished. At the center of the room was a table, stained with blood, crude tools scattered across it. And there, lying motionless, was Rosalia. Her small body had been drained of life, her skin pale and waxen. A collective gasp echoed through the cabin as Maria fell to her knees, her sobs filling the space. But Francisco was gone. The monster had fled into the night, leaving nothing but his horrors behind. Francisco Ortega was never seen again. Some say he vanished into the mountains, continuing his gruesome work in the shadows. Others believe he met a darker fate, consumed by his own madness, transformed into something no longer human. An immortal creature, forever driven by his unholy need for human fat. The villagers tried to move on, but the scars remained. Every child's disappearance, every unexplained shadow